I'm super excited to talk on this topic. This is something that I've truly passionate about, something I've been doing for quite a while. We at the University of Florida were early adopters of the blood flow restriction kind of movement. The Owens Minor system and team came to us at the university and kind of got us some units, and we started implementing it with our UF athletes. I think it was back in 2014. So we've been using it for quite a time, and over that time, over the years, we've kind of developed things that we like and don't like, and we've played with different units, and it's really a key part of my practice today, especially with what I do in the lower half of the body, primarily with all my athletes, runners specifically, but I use it pretty much every single day when I'm treating, and you'll see that as we kind of move through this talk. So again, blood flow restriction for runners is what we're going to talk about today. And let me see if I can get my slides to advance. And from Doug, can you see the slide advance? Did that move for you? Okay.
Yep, we're good.
So our objectives for today, we want to understand really the basics of what blood flow restriction training is all about. We want to see how it can be implemented with both runners that are injured as well as runners that are uninjured, and then dive a little bit deeper into why I find it so valuable for treating foot and ankle issues and just general strengthening of the foot and ankle as a whole. It's something, like I said, that I concentrate a lot of my treatment on, and it's part of everyday treatment with what I do with my patient population. So when we start thinking about hypertrophy, muscle tissue growth and strengthening, there's different methodology and different ways in which this can be accomplished. The primary ways, and there's no substitute for this, it's lifting heavy loads, right? If you can lift heavy, lift heavy. You got to lift about 70 or greater percent of your 1 rep max to really induce the mechanical tension philosophy and mode. And with mechanical tension, what you're talking about there is you're getting some sarcomere lengthening. The mTOR pathway is stimulated, which then stimulates some protein synthesis. Satellite cell activation, which we know is important for muscle growth and repair. So there's a lot of things that occur when you're able to lift heavy, right? But what if you're not able to lift heavy? Are there ways in which we can really stimulate our tissue in such a way that can still mimic that of the environment that occurs with the mechanical tension model, we'll call it? And BFR, or blood flow restriction training, does in fact do that. So that's what we're going to really concentrate a lot of our efforts today on. So how does BFR, or blood flow restriction training, create this metabolic stress? So what happens is when we're doing BFR, we occlude the tissue limb, usually in the upper arm or the upper thigh, somewhere between 50 and 80%. Upper extremity is usually 50% or less. Lower extremity, you can go a little bit higher, you can go as high as 80%. And what you're doing is you're totally restricting venous return, okay? But what you are allowed doing with blood flow restriction therapy is allowing some arterial flow into the region. Again, somewhere between 80%, 70%, somewhere there for the lower extremity, which is what we're going to concentrate on today when we're talking about BFR for runners. And when you do this, what happens is there's metabolic waste that builds up, and that induces a cell swelling response in which lactate and hydrogen ions build up in that area. Again, you see some satellite cell activation, which is important, like we said, for growth and repair. Some hormones are released, some increase in gene expression that are linked to hypertrophy. And then there's also some cardiovascular benefits, such as ATP production, as well as creatine phosphate production. So this metabolic stress is a way in which we can induce some of these hypertrophic responses and use a whole lot less, we'll call it, resistance or stimulus to that given tissue. So what are the components of a blood flow restriction unit? Well, you've got, in most cases, a cuff. And again, the cuff width and size will play a part in terms of how much pressure is able to be induced through that lower limb to occlude that tissue, to occlude those vessels, to allow some arterial flow and none of that venous return. There is a cord that usually adapts or ties in to the actual cuffs, which allows the unit to inflate and create that compression. Some units, like the most common one, which is the Delphi unit here, which is the most expensive one, usually runs somewhere between $5,000 and $6,000 for a unit, is tethered at all times to the athlete. Whereas some of the other units like Suji here, you actually have the unit hooked up, and then once the activity is started, you can detach or disattach or or remove the actual cord from the unit so the athlete can then move freely without being tethered. In the Delphi unit, you see here, there is a screen that's attached to the cord, whereas with the Suji unit, it's more app-based, so you can use it on an iPad or your iPhone, etc. And again, there's a lot of different units out there. These are the two that I primarily use. We have one of these Delphi units at every one of our football tables, treatment tables. So we have like, I don't know, like 10 of them in our football complex. We also have Suji as well. The thing that I like about the Suji ones are, in most cases, you can do them bilaterally at the same time. Whereas with the Delphi, you're pretty much, each unit is only able to attach and tether to one limb. So in order to get your both bilateral lower extremities working, you've got to have two units, which is not the case in the Suji models. So blood flow restriction training in the injured runner. Where does this come into play, or why does this come into play? Well, obviously we know we're dealing with injured runners. We're dealing with injured or damaged tissue. And we know that damaged tissue may not be able to tolerate loads that are at 70% or greater of that 1 rep max. So if we can't achieve that kind of stress or load through the tissue, what are we to do? So that's where blood flow restriction training comes in. And you're able to stimulate that metabolic stress model and fatigue at pressures that are typically lower. Somewhere between 20 and 30% of your 1 rep max are the resistances that you're able to use when applying blood flow restriction training. So again, why is this important? Because you're allowing that tissue to recover and be safely stimulated without allowing for excessive atrophy of not really stimulating that tissue at all, because that tissue is somewhat damaged, right? So an injured tissue, it's damaged. You don't want to put stress through it. So instead of doing nothing at all, we're able to implement this blood flow restriction training to, again, create that hypertrophic environment at very minimal resistance and stress loads. So when can you perform blood flow restriction training? Well, there's different theories and different ways in which you can do it. You can do it early in the session. I do this sometimes if I want to kind of ramp up and really try to stimulate as many of the muscle fibers as I can. Basically, whenever you stimulate a muscle tissue, you always go through the type 1 fibers first. Those are more of the slow twitch. Those are more of the fibers that are more endurance oriented. And obviously, if we want to really get to the strength and the power muscles, we have to get to those type 2 fibers. So blood flow restriction training allows us to really work through the fatigue at a faster rate so that we can actually start stimulating some of those type 2 fibers. And you can also use it as a finisher. When those tissues are already fatigued and you really want to just kind of knock them out, blood flow restriction training is a great way to kind of really take that athlete to the next level and really make sure that they're getting the most bang for their buck with their training session. It's almost like taking a tissue to failure, so to speak. Okay. I tend to use it more in the beginning of my treatment as a way to improve muscle recruitment. So how can you progress with blood flow restriction training? You can adapt the pressure. So again, I wouldn't go higher than 80% occlusion. But if you're not familiar or the athlete has never done it before, you may not start that high. You might start at 70 or 60% occlusion for the lower extremity. You can obviously increase the resistance. So as an athlete gets stronger, just like everything else, we're talking 20% of their 1 rep max. So as they get stronger, they are going to be able to tolerate a little bit more weight as you go. So you can progress the weight. Let's say you're doing a leg extension exercise with a 2-pound ankle weight, a 2-pound cuff weight, right? So you're doing it for a couple of weeks, and you know what? It's getting pretty easy. The athlete isn't getting fatigued as they used to. One way in which you can make it more difficult is adding a pound, let's say. You're not going to have to add significant weight to this. So again, you're only going to go up to 3 or 4 pounds maybe with this type of resistance. But again, it's a way to progressively load. You can make the reps more difficult. You can increase the rep range in which you're working. As you'll see in some of the things later on with how I work with the lower extremity, you're going to see I do some non-traditional things with my rep schemes. And then again, time occluded. The longer you're occluded, the more that tissue swelling and that cell swelling that's going to occur. But you don't want to exceed 15 to 20 minutes. I usually try to stay under 15 minutes of total occlusion time. And sometimes I may go a little bit higher, but generally speaking, a good guideline is 15 minutes of occlusion time is really recommended.
Scott, quick question just came
Sure.
in about how you determine the amount of blood flow that is occluded.
That is a great question. And the machines typically do that for you. Okay. So, early on, the history of blood flow restricted training goes way back in time, and a lot of weightlifters used to do it. And they used to do what they call katsu training, where they take these tight bands and they literally just tie these bands around their arms or their legs to totally occlude that tissue pressure, right? That circulation, and increase the pressure, obviously. But there was no way of really gauging how that was occurring. And that's where these more expensive kind of devices came in. And the Delphi one is one that was, again, brought onto the scene. and it basically auto regulates, meaning that it tests first what it takes to totally occlude all blood flow in and out. And then what it does is you set the pressure as to what you want to allow in, 80%, 70%, 60%. And then as you're performing a movement, the Owens unit, the Delphi unit, actually auto regulates, whereas some of the other units don't do that, but they still take that total occlusion pressure, and then you're able to ramp a percentage on that based on what it takes to, again, completely occlude that limb. Did that make sense? That answer that question? So the machines do that for you in essence. If you don't have a machine doing that for you, you're losing some of the safety guide rails that are really what make blood flow restriction therapy more therapeutic, and not just kind of like bro science going into the gym and just strapping bands on your arms and totally restricting that pressure. It does put a little bit more of a scientific kind of spin on things. Okay, so hopefully that answered that question. In terms of an example, so let's talk about an injured runner. Okay, so let's say you have an injured runner that has a metatarsal stress fracture, common injury we see in our runners. So let's say I start in the early stages, and I want to maybe occlude at 80%, because again, a lower extremity tissue is best occluded at that 80%, maybe a little bit less, maybe 70, but I wouldn't go higher than 80. And you can even start with blood flow restriction training on the contralateral limb. So again, if in a region that's highly effused, you may not want to do blood flow restriction training until some of that swelling goes down. It is totally safe to do on the other side, and there is a systemic effect associated with blood flow restriction training due to hormones released and all of those other more systemic releases that occur when that metabolic stress pathway is induced. Okay, so let's say I have another athlete that's post-surgical, an Achilles repair. I may start, visit 1, visit 2, visit 3, which is maybe 1, 2, 3 weeks out, doing blood flow restriction on the contralateral limb to make sure that that limb doesn't atrophy itself from disuse and not using it the way I normally would, but I'm also getting some stimulus to the other side through the systemic effects. But in this case, again, what I may start with in a metatarsal stress fracture early on, I may do some TheraBand ankle 4-way. I may start with 2 sets of 60 reps with a 30-second rep rest between sets. I may do some seated TheraBand resisted hallux extension and flexion, maybe at a rep scheme of 3 sets of 30 with a 30-second rest between sets. And I may even do some seated doming or short foot, 3 sets of 30 with 30-second rest between sets. Again, keeping that total treatment time hopefully under 15 minutes, but it's a way to stimulate that tissue. Again, I'm not doing the conventional, as we'll see in a couple of slides. The typical rep scheme that you see with blood flow restriction is a 30 rep, 30-second rest, 15 rep, 30-second rest, 15 rep, 30-second rest. So you're going to get 3 sets of 15. The first set is 30, and in between each of those sets is a 30-second rest. That's the typical, that's the generic, that's the kind of go-to standard for most blood flow restriction training. That's kind of what they teach. But I want you guys to know that when we're talking about the lower extremity and we're talking about these muscles and these these areas being so important for endurance and such, we need to stimulate them at a greater capacity. And again, we're stimulating them with TheraBand. We're not able to normally get, that 70% of that 1 rep max load through some of these smaller tissues with TheraBand. So I think that blood flow restriction therapy, as we'll talk about, is a great way in which we can kind of induce that hypertrophic effect with that lesser type of resistance, such as a TheraBand or even balance work, etc. But this is one way in which you can start it early on.
So Scott, just two just relevant questions just came in here
Sure.
related to that last slide. Just clarification that the rest during the exercise or the rest is stopping the occlusion, right? You're keeping the occlusion on and they're just resting. It's not
Correct.
letting the occlusion off, right?
The occlusion stays constant throughout the entire exercise. Now, there are times where some patients won't tolerate the occlusion for the 15-minute length. So sometimes maybe I'll do, in this particular example, maybe I'll do the T-band ankle 4-way, 2 sets of 60. In between each set of 60, I'm going to give a 30-second break. And then they're like, Scott, I'm dying. That's too much. You can either A, decrease the pressure, or B, you can totally remove the pressure, let them rest, and then bring it up for the next exercise. The longer you're occluded, the more the benefit's going to be up into a point, like I said, 15 minutes or so. But the goal is to keep them occluded for that time, even during the rest periods. That's where that it's actually more uncomfortable sometimes during the rest than it is actually during the activity itself. So that's how I would start during the early stages. To progress during the mid stages, maybe I'll do the T-band ankle four-way, 3 sets of 60. So I'm adding another set of 60. Maybe now I'm going to do some standing hallux extension, hallux flexion. Or maybe now I'm going to do some balance exercises, eyes open, eyes closed. And instead of doing any type of rep scheme, I'm going to do more time. So I'm going to do maybe 4 sets of 30 seconds where they're balancing. And at this stage, you can actually start doing some biking or swimming to maybe get some of those cardiovascular benefits of blood flow restriction training. Now, again, I wouldn't take the Delphi unit into the pool because, again, you're tethered. It's not going to work. But the Suji system, because it is untethered and waterproof, you can actually swim with it. You can actually do some deep water running with it. I tend to go more with the bicycle. So the bicycle is a great way to do blood flow restriction training where maybe you're cycling for a minute, you're resting for a minute, cycling for 2 minutes, resting a minute. So there are different ways in which you can stimulate that aerobic kind of capacity, that ATP stimulation, that CP stimulation in an aerobic type of state here. And again, with a metatarsal stress fracture, they're probably not going to be running. So one way in which you can get them non-weight bearing and do some aerobic training would be in this capacity as well. So it's another good tool for that. And then late stages, this is something where I kind of use what I call the blackboard. Here's a picture of it here. You can either do a forefoot bias or rear foot bias. You can actually have the foot like working into inversion and eversion positions, either in a single leg stance or early on. Sometimes I may allow them to put their other leg on the ground and have them actively just go into the inversion and eversion kind of frontal plane movements. I usually do 2 sets of 15 with a forefoot bias. So with a forefoot bias, you see that long dowel in the larger wood block in the front part. And if you wanted to switch that around and lock down the forefoot and allow the rear foot to move, you would just kind of change the configuration of the Velcro and those little dowels. So it's a great tool to kind of work on balance. It's a great tool to work on foot strength. It's something that I do in conjunction with BFR pretty much all the time. In this late stage, I may even begin some single leg calf raises on the shuttle or a leg press. In this state, I usually do 3 sets of 15, and the last set I might do to failure, because again, the goal is to try to totally fatigue that tissue, and again with a 30-second rest scheme in between. And then what I also do to make it sometime more specific for my runners, I will do a single leg running man with a light TheraBand as the resistance. And I may do that typical 30, 15, 15, 15 rep scheme with this type of exercise. And what that looks like is this right here. There's no blood flow restriction unit on this exercise. I just want you guys to see what it looks like. If it'll play.
Late in the practice.
Yeah,
Couldn't afford a better model for this, Scott? Come
What's
on.
that? That's
Couldn't
a great
get
model.
a better model to do this exercise there?
You know? So again, Doug is talking. If you go to the Run DNA app, you can see all these. But it's a great way to kind of what's that?
Now we made all of the exercises from the app are actually on our YouTube channel now.
Perfect.
So there's lots of exercises on there as well.
So again, it's a great way to kind of work on the entire body, simulating balance, working on glute strength, working on foot strength. And again, when you have the blood flow restriction unit on, all of those muscles that are working are getting benefit from it. So it's really a great kind of finisher exercise to kind of get everything kind of primed and ready to go. So it's one of my favorite things to do with a runner, and it's one of my favorite things to do with blood flow restriction training. So blood flow restriction training in the uninjured runner. We saw that again. Why is it important in the injured runner? Because again, it's a way to strengthen without putting the same high loads through those tissues. But what about the uninjured runner? Why is it important? Well, most runners run for exercise and they don't exercise to run, right? So most runners take their shoes, they run, they put them on, they go out for their run, and that's pretty much their workout. They don't do what needs to be done to really help facilitate keeping them powerful, keeping them strong, decreasing their likelihood for injury by increasing their tissue capacity, and also by strengthening and work on improving performance as well. So BFR on the uninjured runner, why would you do it? Well, again, strength training is critical for performance injury prevention, like I just said. It allows for strength with less stress and soreness. So again, if you're in season, you don't want to put the same type of soreness and stress through tissues. Blood flow restriction training is a great supplement. And I have an example on the next slide to show about how you can implement it in the middle of season. It's a great way to efficiently target smaller muscles. So again, it's not like you can grab a dumbbell with your toes and load your intrinsic foot muscles, right? So how do you strengthen the muscles that are responsible for balance and stabilization of your foot? So again, if we're doing those exercises as part of our treatment anyway, why not put the blood flow restriction unit on them and get a little bit more bang for your buck by inducing that metabolic stress? And then lastly, it's a great when equipment is limited. So again, if you're limited with what you have available to you as a runner, you don't have a gym membership, you just like to go out and run, a blood flow restriction training is affordable. Some of the, like the Suji unit, it's very affordable, where you can have it at your house. People travel with it. When they travel, if they travel, they go to hotels, they take it with them. You can do your exercises with body weight. You can do your exercises with TheraBand. And it's a way to, again, strengthen tissue without having to have heavy equipment or dumbbells and kettlebells at your disposal, or heavy, type of squat racks and such. It's a great tool to implement in situations where equipment may be limited. So here's an example of a 5,000 meter runner, just finished a high mileage week, not feeling fully recovered. So what are we going to do during their week of strength training? So we don't want to kind of give them a complete rest. We want to keep them primed. We want to keep them moving. We want to keep that tissue targeted. What can we do? Well, we don't necessarily want to squat them with 300 pounds on their back. We don't want to put them on a deadlift program where they're lifting, significant heavy weights and overstressing their body in a week where they're already beaten up. So what are we going to do? We can implore the BFR to help, again, stimulate some of those responses while putting those tissues, the joints, at significantly less rest, or less stress rather. So we can do a leg press, but instead of doing a leg press with 70% of their 1 rep max, we can strap the cuffs on, and we're doing it with 20% of their 1 rep max. We can do a leg extension machine, same type of thing, 20% of their 1 rep max, whatever that weight may be. We can do body weight calf raises, either single leg or double leg. We can change the rep schemes. We can make it easier. We can make it harder. Again, the goal with blood flow restriction training is to fatigue the tissue. And I promise you, your athletes will feel this. Even just doing a leg extension with a 2-pound cuff weight, if they do the 30, 15, 15, 15 rep scheme with a 2-pound cuff weight, they will feel it by set 2. I promise you that. I had a football player that weighed 260 pounds with a 2-pound cuff weight, pretty much laid out at the end of this with a 2 to 3 pound cuff weight doing that rep scheme. So it doesn't take much to get a lot of bang for your buck. So that would be day 1. Day 2 could be targeting some of the other tissue during the week. You can do more of a posterior chain trap bar deadlift. Maybe it's just the trap bar itself. You can do some machine hamstring curls. You can do some isometric soleus holds. Again, all of that stimulates those tissues, and you're trying to fatigue the tissue. You give it a little bit of rest. You give it a couple of sets, and then you're off and running. Again, keeping that rep scheme at a manageable rate, but keep that total occlusion time around 15 minutes or less. Another case, again, as we get older, this is one of the situations where I feel blood flow restriction training has only scratched the surface. I am a firm believer that as we age, pretty much every one of us needs to have a unit at our disposal. And the reason I say this is such. As we get older, we know we get weaker. Our tolerance for putting heavy loads on our back for squatting is not great. Our joints can't tolerate the loads that they did when we were 20, 30 years old, right? So what blood flow restriction training allows for us to continue to improve, continue to gain strength in tissue that is not really capable of enduring those type of heavy loads as they once were. So I really think in the aging adult, it is a great tool in which we can start implementing. So here's again an example of a 60-year-old recreational runner with a history of back and hip pain. So putting loads on their back to squat is not great. Having them squat depth with any type of weight may not be great for their hips. They don't have any access to the gym. So what is this person to do? So BFR at 80% occlusion, using 20 to 30% of their 1 rep max, using 30 seconds of rest in between sets is a great way to start with some of their gym exercises or some of their training to keep them running as they get older and want to continue to running as they go into their 60s and 70s, etc. Now, again, I wouldn't do all of these at one time. This wouldn't be like the recipe that I would do every single session, but you can pick and choose some of these from, if they're weight training 1 to 2 times a week, pick 2 or 3 of these each and every week. Change it up from time to time. Keep it fun, keep it interesting, but you can do body weight squats. You can do leg extensions, like I said, with cuff weights. You can do some lateral band walks. You can do body weight calf raises. You can do banded good mornings. You can do hamstring curls with ankle weights. You can do isometrics, such as soleus holds, like I said. You can do single leg balance. You can do balance on RX pads. And then you can do some of the general foot and ankle strengthening, as we're going to talk about. Again, you can vary the rep scheme as you see in this example here. I use a lot of the 30, 15, 15, 15 traditional type of rep schemes. But again, you can see also with some of the balance work, I did 30 seconds, or with the isometric holds, I did 15 seconds. So you can increase that. You can play with that. There's no one way to do this. There's no right or wrong. There's a lot of different ways to skin the cat. The goal is that you're fatiguing that tissue. You want that tissue to be tired by the end. Okay. So BFR in the foot and ankle, why do I use it pretty much with all of my patients that I see? If I'm treating somebody for a knee and towards the end of their rehab, and I'm trying to do more lower extremity as a whole type of strengthening or training, I use the BFR quite a bit when I'm targeting the foot and ankle, because again, I feel like we don't adequately strengthen and resist and put adequate resistance through our foot and ankle musculature to really stimulate that hypertrophic change. So I think that if we just strap the BFR unit on, doing the same traditional exercises that we normally do, you're just getting a little bit more bang for your buck. And hopefully that makes sense. So again, the foot and ankle is critical for running. We all know that. It's traditionally difficult to adequately load the foot and ankle. Again, TheraBand ain't cutting it. When I do TheraBand strengthening, I end up, before I was doing BFR training, I was doing several sets of 60 repetitions, because I felt like that's what it took with TheraBand to get that tissue to kind of get fatigued. Their endurance muscles, they need to be able to tolerate that type of endurance. And I just didn't feel like TheraBand was providing me the adequate resistance that we needed. So again, the load requirements using BFR are significantly less than traditional resistance and tissue tension modeling. And then you can think more of the higher rep schemes when you're using foot and ankle strengthening as the target. So again, blood flow restriction using TheraBand, traditional four-way ankle that probably every single one of us here do in the gym and with our patients. I do it again with my hallux extension and flexion, really targeting some of those small little foot intrinsics. I do it on the shuttle, which is almost like a leg extension. I do it single leg, working on calf raises. I do it single leg, doing leg press. I do it in a whole host of different ways. But if we're targeting the foot and ankle, again, calf raises on that board is fantastic. I do it while the patient is doing balance exercises and having a catch. And for some reason, it's not playing my media here. But what you can see from this is they're standing on that blackboard with a 4-foot bias, meaning the 4-foot is allowed to move into the frontal plane. And they're having a catch. Usually I do 3 sets of 30 repetitions of that catch standing on that board with the occlusion training on. And then we can also do toe yoga, hallux extension, hallux flexion, toe splaying, all of that with the BFR units on. Totally appropriate. And again, really, really great tools to really increase that metabolic stress that we talked about so much already. General recommendations for my occlusion training for the lower extremity, 80% is where I typically live. But again, don't be afraid to go lower if your athlete or runner is new to blood flow restriction training. It is not.
What's the like minimum effectiveness there? Like, what's the like, if you're gonna go below this, like, don't even bother type thing?
I don't know if there's a minimum. I technically and traditionally don't go below like 50% on the lower extremity. For the upper extremity, I wouldn't go higher than 50%. So there you could go a little bit lower, like 30 or 40% occlusion, but traditionally 50% on the upper extremity does fine. More so than anything else. If you stick at 70%, at least for the first couple, the athletes just got to get used to it. Once they get used to it, I think they tolerate it a little bit better. It's just getting used to being uncomfortable. It feels very crampy. It's just one of those things where they just need to acclimate. And if you want to start them at 60 and 70% for the first couple of sessions and then build up to 80, that's fine. But I traditionally don't go lower than like 60. That's usually where I stay. Most of my patients tolerate 80 fine. But again, I'm dealing with high level athletes that are used to putting themselves in uncomfortable situations from time to time. But the general population runner, 60, 70% shouldn't be an issue. In terms of reps, we talked about this. Traditionally, the one that you see all the time and the one that's preached about is the 30, 15, 15, 15. I tend to think higher reps when I'm dealing with the lower extremity, especially the foot and ankle, whether it be 4 sets of 30, 3 sets of 60. If I'm doing more time-based, 3 or 4 sets of 15 to 30 seconds, and it's great to use with balance exercises. Those foot muscles do start screaming at a level that they don't traditionally scream at when you're just standing on an RX pad without it, let's say. In terms of how often do you want to do blood flow restriction training in the injured population, the injured population, I do it 2 to 3 times a week. In the uninjured population, you can just do it to supplement their regular training 1 time a week for, every 1 time a week or once every 2 weeks. It's great to use when in a high competitive situation when they need to recover a little bit more. It's a great way to kind of add that into their periodization or periodized training block, so that they have almost like a deload without necessarily kind of having to take suffer too much from any type of a lack of stress, we'll say. Duration, like I've stressed, keep it under 15 minutes. I usually do 2 to 3 exercises per session in that 15 minutes. Contraindications, you wouldn't want to do it if the wound is open, if they have any circulatory issues, any cardiac issues, pregnancy, rhabdo. Again, these aren't necessarily things that would be definitely stops, but if you wanted to do blood flow restriction training, I would have them and have you check with their physicians to make sure they're okay with what they've got going on.
Varicose veins for the circular, is that a issue?
Not usually. I usually don't find that a problem. If they have too much, you may want to, in that particular case, maybe decrease the occlusion pressure. That may be something that's a little bit more tolerable and a little bit more comfortable for them, but I don't see it as an issue. I've never seen somebody say, I'm not going to do BFR because they have varicose veins. Just be mindful of it. And again, if it's bothersome for them, then obviously don't do it. With all of this, obviously, you got to get your patient's willingness to participate. Just like anything else, just tell them about what they will see is the leg will get red. The leg will get, the goal is to create that pump, right? It's that pump that everyone wants in the gym when they're working out their biceps and their arms and their chest, right? You just get it a lot quicker here with the blood flow restriction. You see the veins popping, you see the leg gets nice and big and almost like, sometimes it turns like a little purple, it gets a little blanchy, but as soon as you allow that blood flow to return, all of it goes back to normal. Sometimes it feels a little itchy because of, again, the lack of circulation, but again, all normal. Once they do it a couple of times, they get very acclimated to it and they tolerate it a lot better. There is some promising research regarding blood flow restriction and using it after exercise as a way to recover. So there was some strength gains found by some studies in which an athlete did exercises without BFR, and then after the exercises, put the cuffs on for 15 minutes of continuous just sitting there, and they actually had better strength gains than the group that strength trained and didn't put the cuffs on in a passive manner after. So that's kind of cool. And you can also use the cuffs much like a Normatec boot as a pumping mechanism, where you have it pumped on for a couple of seconds and then you have it off, or a minute on, minute off, minute on, minute off, to kind of help pump some of the lactic acid out after activity. I know a lot of baseball players are using, in the upper extremity, a lot of pitchers are using it as a way to recover after throwing, to kind of help pump some of the nasty kind of metabolic waste that's built up in the arm after throwing. So there's a lot of promising literature that's coming out regarding blood flow restriction. And Suji actually is one of the companies that's really leading in the recovery side of things. Their app actually has the recovery features built into it. So it will actually pump and deflate on its own based on whatever protocol you program into it. So that's kind of neat. But when you are using that in that manner, you do have to stay tethered to the device, which is fine. And again, the Normatec boots have gained popularity. I've seen people travel with the blood flow restriction cuffs like Suji on the plane and do it while they're sitting on the plane to help with recovery after a game or traveling back from a weekend meet or whatever it may be. So the take-home message here is, if the tissue is capable of handling load, there's no substitute for heavy resistance training, right? So I don't want to sit here and say blood flow restriction training should take the place of all strengthening you do. That is not the case at all. If you can load that tissue adequately with load, do it. However, there are many cases many cases in both the injured as well as in the aging or in the athletic population, in which it may not be appropriate to put that type of load through a given tissue. And in such cases, blood flow restriction training is a wonderful way to make strength gains using a different pathway, the metabolic stress pathway, to achieve those goals. If you guys want, I've talked a lot about Suji. It's not the only one that's out there. Like I said, I use the Delphi one pretty much a lot in clinic at our training facilities, because we have them all over the place. They do auto regulate. They're the gold standard. But the ones that are a little bit more affordable that you can get as a home unit or have multiple units in your clinics, Suji is one of them. Smart Cuffs is another one. The people at Suji have offered a 10% discount if you use the Scott 10 code. So, feel free to go to Run Safe Run Fast, which is my website. And there's a link there in which you can kind of just takes you right to the Suji site. You pump this in and you can get that 10%. So use it if you want, don't use it if you don't want, it's fine, whatever you want to do, but it's there if you want to save some money.